A glance in the mirror. Chapter 34. The pattern of life. The family still went as a whole to the library, whatever the weather, where all the children had their own choice of books. Terry still bought a bag of sweets to ease the passage home, and the Conway Hall and Chiswick Music Society still provided enjoyable concerts. Trips to museums, galleries and the Commonwealth Institute continued apace. Blackberries picked at the end of summer, walks along the canal, and holidays to farms and guest houses. Scouts, cubs, brownies, choir practice for Simon and David, and all the other routines continued unabated. Fortunately, all the children responded to the routine without complaint, enjoying and learning from the experiences. Sally and Terry were complimented wherever they went on the good behaviour of the children. As a family, they all did the same thing together. There was neither any friction nor dissent. They still didn't have a television to watch. Card games were played quite a lot. Monopoly, chess, draughts and Lego took up any spare moments. Once started, piano lessons continued, accompanied by the annual exam. The children took and passed each exam as it came along, having them do their practice by now such a normal everyday occurrence. They complied uncomplainingly. And this is what Terry thought would happen all those years ago, when he first thought of his children having lessons, an acceptance of what was to be normal practice, an automatic response. Terry's mother had been a diabetic for about 10 years, treating herself with insulin injections prescribed by her doctor. The parents were living at Pinner Green with Nan, who by this time had also retired and needed a home. Albert was 80, still active and quite capable of walking to North Harrow to visit us. He never understood when my mother was due for an injection, nor did he keep a check on what she was doing. Nan phoned one day to say that there was an emergency. Mum was ill. Terry suspected that it had to do with her medication, and when he arrived, Bert and Nan were pacing round and round, not knowing what to do. Mum was by this time in a delirious state. The doctor had been called and arrived shortly after Terry, and asked a number of questions about what had gone on and what medication was administered. No one knew, and this lack of knowledge totally threw the doctor, who then dithered about, saying that perhaps it would be better to get Mum to hospital. She had by this time passed out into a coma, and with that Terry returned home to await news, which was not long in coming. His mother was declared dead within a few hours. She never regained consciousness. She was 61. What a terrible waste! For as Terry discovered, her death was caused by insufficient insulin. Had the doctor given her a large dose of insulin, she would not have gone into a coma. Even if the cause had been by some other reason, an extra dose would not have had a disastrous result. Bert was now at a loss. He did not want Nan to be in the flat with him, although he probably realized that life would be difficult on his own. He appreciated that it would be impossible to live with either Stan's family or mine, for neither of us had any room. Bert never came to terms with his loss. It was patently clear that he would be far better off staying where he was, sharing the flat with Nan. He wasn't happy, though, for whatever reason. They had known each other since Bert's wedding. He never spoke of it, and gradually they both deteriorated. Nan died within a year, and Dad a year later. The 1970 general election was lost by the Labour government, rather than won by the Tory. Political writers did not regard the Wilson government 1966 to 1970 as a success. Even though 8 of the cabinet had first-class degrees from Oxford, it was a turning point of a long decline in the party's fortunes. In domestic policies, it had failed to adapt its thinking to the social changes that had initiated after the war. Class feelings were beginning to recede. Living standards had changed. It was it had initiated after the war. Class feelings were beginning to recede, living standards had risen, and with the boom in house purchase most people felt they had something to conserve. The trades union were now an obstacle both to the Labour Party and its working when in power. Terry was working in a union firm. Within their staff were some key national and local officials, workers who attended all the branch meetings. They dominated how the union dealt with industrial changes taking place. Much of the conversation during the day was about the industry and its working. The annual cost of living index was the guiding parameter for that year's round of talks, and this was on top of the London waiting allowance, which was supposed to balance out the extra costs needed for travelling and other out-of-pocket expenses. A very keen interest was kept on all other industrial negotiations to see their place in the wage hierarchy was kept in place. Trade union membership increased as industrial action became possible. In the 1978-9 wage round, membership reached 13 million and half the workforce was now a member. The three largest unions, the TGWU, the engineers and general municipal workers, and this period became the winter of discontent. The unemployment figures remained at 1.3 million by the time of the general election. Mrs. Thatcher became the first woman Prime Minister, one of 7 in Parliament, up against 246 men. The news scanners coming from Germany, able to convert black and white continuous tone artworks into a suitable form for letterpress, were making inroads into conventional methods. It was essential for firms to keep ahead of the opposition coming from abroad, and this was not just about trying to entice work back to the United Kingdom, it was more about trying to halt the decline in the printing industry as a whole. Nor was it just about faster production methods introduced by film companies and makers of other printing machines. All these changes affected the whole process. Letterpress printing was being undermined by simple, cheap, faster plate-making methods for lithography, and even new scanners could not make the letterpress process sustainable long-term. About this time, local newspapers began to change over from letterpress to the lithographic process, longer print runs made possible by new printing plate surfaces. It was cheaper to use a thin, light-sensitive coated printing plate, which could be quickly altered if necessary, rather than making up a new letterpress form. Letterpress firms were closing down, and men paid off. Many firms going bankrupt. All these skilled men in the newspaper industry had earned high wages, were now unemployed. The photogravure industry couldn't take them all, nor could litho. The unions, whose job it was to find places of work for their members, filled vacancies in litho, organising retraining at printing colleges. Eddie Shar, owner of the Messenger Group of 60 newspapers, in dispute with unions when they tried to enforce a closed shop at his Warrington works and newspaper offices in Manchester. This group, one of the first to operate web offset litho presses, became the initiators of the first coloured newspapers, before the colour supplements. This persuaded the national newspaper barons to look more closely at the process. Men continued to be made redundant. Some took early retirement, others found work. Those who made their way into the lithographic industry had to become used to working with firm film rather than metal. Some had been operating typesetting machines or making up black and white pictures into blocks. Now they had to learn about colour printing and understand the reasons why colour correction was necessary. Apprenticeships were stopped to create workplaces, forcing firms to take on trainees, and overtime was banned. All these stopgap methods to retrain, distribute labour and cushion changes in the industry were all short-term. What it did do is make the whole printing business uneconomic, forcing advertisers to seek work abroad. These changes in working arrangements continued for years. The unions continued to put a block on accepting new apprentices until all the unemployed were given jobs. Cutting off employing new young workers was soon felt by the industry. Skills were lost, and the trade quickly became filled with an ageing staff. Overtime was heavily restricted, and new working arrangements negotiated with the owners. Militancy reared its ugly head, and those workers who spoiled for a fight had a field day. The union still negotiated an annual wage review, which always resulted in higher wages, shorter hours and longer holidays. Strikes were threatened and an overtime ban implemented. Gradually the work was taken abroad, then stayed there, and management sought to find a way out of the impasse. The trade was becoming uncompetitive. Those firms who supplied the trade with parts of the final process started to feel the pinch, and many went out of business. The major film manufacturers competed to bring out a method of colour correction prior to half-tone screening. The first photographic correction systems used a series of continuous tone film overlays to correct the ink deficiencies, and this was followed by a double overlay masking system. Later, another system used a single multi-layered masking film strapped to the original colour transparency. Flat copper originals, watercolours and oil paintings converted to transparencies. All these systems were introduced to reduce the amount of handwork necessary. Eventually, a film system devised that completely obviated the need for more correction, but it was too late. Electronic scanning saw to the demise of film correction, and the film companies began to feel the pinch. The Klishograph, invented by Dr. Hell, mechanically produced an engraved halftone image that could be printed to take the place of a halftone block. This machine was highly successful. Later on, the machine was adapted for colour separation work and given the name of Vario to differentiate it from its brother. The Vario was a flatbed scanner using the latest electronic scanning techniques of lasers and filters. The computer was programmed to separate the transparency into the 4 printing colours, including black, correcting the 3 primary ink colours, magenta, cyan and yellow, for their spectral deficiencies, whilst at the same time producing a half-tone set of images ready for printing down to machine plate. Enlargement or reduction made to suit the customer's requirements on a set of plastic foils contacted for plate making. The object was to make the film companies, the camera operators and the colour retouchers redundant, thereby reducing costs and speeding up the flow of production. At the monthly union meetings, scare stories prevailed, promulgated the demise of handwork. It was obvious that computer-generated colour-corrected half-tone screen work plus type matter would rapidly reduce the numbers of workers in pre-printing departments. Newspaper owners talked about producing colour inserts. The workers knew this would eventually, by stealth, full-blooded colour magazines. Provincial newspapers based on in the Midlands were used in the lithographic process. The factories had been proposed to be built to take the new web offset presses. The simple page make-up system for the lithographic process was far quicker and cheaper to keep the publications current with the latest news. The aluminium plate convenient, lighter and quicker to change. It was obvious that eventually national newspapers would join the exodus away from letterpress once they had negotiated with the unions. To make this change come about, the massive old letterpress machines had to be moved out, the process and handling of the film being very different from metal. The photogravure process, already operating real-fed printing machines, contemplated that they too might be capable of producing newspapers, particularly the supplements, which could be produced days before the final machine run for daily newspapers. The unions pressurized the newspaper owners, telling them that new employment deals would have to be negotiated, stimulated the newspaper magnates to devise a radical scheme to bring this change about without informing the printers' union. It all came about very slowly. What did undermine the status quo for Terry was the steady reduction in profitability. Too many jobs were badly retouched. Standards of reproduction deteriorated, and production times were not met. Terry could see that it was only going to be a time before the final collapse of the firm. The enlarged staffs, now made up of newly trained men, were not capable of doing the job properly, to the times estimated, and with that thought he had to consider what to do and where to go. He scanned the vacancy lists. The trades union were being taken over by a younger membership from the public services. Amongst these were Trotskyists from a group known as the Militant Tendencies. These left-wing socialists infiltrated the unions, meaning to cause trouble, especially to the Labour Party. There were a number of these radicals in the print unions, and they were interested in organisations like Age Concern, Shelter, Child Poverty Action Groups, and other charitable organisations. The Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament, another active group, succeeded in converting the labour movement for utilitarianism, and this was against the trade union members of the Labour Party. Women's liberation movement was growing. There was an outcry about sexual discrimination at the workplace. Homosexuals were beginning to come out to show themselves, seeking solutions to their social problems through political action. Once again, Terry was beginning to feel constricted, but having to find more money for the family. There was only one way to improve his earning, and that was by moving. He started to keep his eye on the union vacancy list. It was not long before he saw a vacancy for a firm, which was only just down the road at Wharf Road, Islington, a firm of general printers who wanted a retoucher. And as usual, there was only a one-man, one-job white card sent out. That meant you had the job if it suited. It didn't matter what the firm thought of you. If you had a bad name in the trade, they had to accept you.